Well, Bill, thank you for that very, very kind introduction. It is really great to be here. As Tony the Tiger would say, it's great to be here. And I've learned so much already in the first half of this morning. So, I said if I'm going to come, I'm going to really make the most of it. I saw the speakers, I saw the attendees, and I said this is going to be time very well spent, and it already has. In fact, Russ, we haven't a chance to meet yet, but I really enjoyed yours and everybody else's presentation, fellow Northwestern alum. And so I downloaded the Boomerang app at lunch, and I took my whole inbox, substantial, and I just boomeranged it. I'm scared like hell what's going to happen in 2 weeks when it comes charging back to me. So I thought what I would do with the time we have together is do three things. Tell you a little bit about my journey, and I'm a little self-conscious of that. I don't like to talk about myself very much, but I'll tell you my journey, how I got to where I am today. I'll tell you a little bit about the Kellogg journey, which I think is vastly more interesting. And then I'll tell you where we think we're going, And Nick started the day, I think, brilliantly with a lot of really, I wouldn't even call it provocative. And provocative, yes, but also, the world is upon us right now. And how does a company like Kellogg think about that? So I hope that works. So, my life is one of brands, right? But when I, think about how lucky I am, I started, I'm from New York. I'm the son of a New York City fireman. My mother emigrated from Ireland when she was 18 years old. Kind of the classic first to go to college story. So how does that kid, where 25% of his high school went to college, how does that kid become, the leader of the Kellogg Company? It's an accident, right? Just a series of happy accidents. But one of the best things that happened to me was the first job that I had coming out of college was right here in Southern California with the E&J Gallo Winery. And I think everybody in this room knows E&J Gallo, probably have lots of different opinions about the company, but recognize its just unbelievable significance to the wine business, the beverage business in this country. And I had a firsthand seat right out of college to that. And it was really the gift that just never stopped giving for me. And so I joined them in 1987 in their management development program. And they promoted me very rapidly, several times. Which is what they're known to do. I was 22, I just turned 22 years old, and I was the manager of the LA chain division. So I had like 300 people working for me, about 298 who were older than me. And if that's not a humbling learning experience, nothing is. But I tell you that because it was so formative for me. And, I was here in Southern California, again, running the chain division. I got to know Ernest Gallo. I got to know Joe Gallo, I got to know the family. And, Ernest would come down here regularly, and I'd go out and tour grocery stores with Ernest Gallo. And, if you don't learn something from somebody like that, then you're just not paying attention. And I went back to them after, that job, while in that job, and said, I want to go back to business school. I never thought I'd have the opportunity to go back to business school, but you've given me that opportunity because you put me in such a gigantic job at such a young age. And they said, well, we don't really believe in business school around here, but how are you going to pay for it? This was Joe Gallo actually talking to me. And I said, well, I'm going to borrow the money because I don't have any money. You don't pay me that much. And, living here in Southern California is important. I had zero savings. I was still paying off my undergraduate student loans. And they said, well, if you'll come back and work for us, we'll sponsor you and we'll pay for it. And that's exactly what they did. And so I rejoined Gallo when I finished my MBA, went to Chicago and worked for the Romano Brothers Beverage Company, which isn't around anymore, but Buddy and Mike Romano were legends, and I got to work for them and again, just learned a tremendous amount and decided with still several years of commitment to go with Gallo that I just had this idea I couldn't get out of my head, and that was to start a microbrewery in Chicago, because Chicago didn't have one. And who but for me should do that, right? And so I went to the Gallos and I said, we should start a microbrewery together with your scale and capability and so forth. We should do like 10 of these in the 10 biggest cities and so forth. And they said, it's not really a bad idea, but we're committed to the wine business and moving up the varietal chain and so on and so forth. And I said, I've got to do this. I can't get the idea out of my head. And so I left, and I was ready to write the check for all the money that I still owed them. And they said, you've more than repaid us. Good luck, and if it doesn't work out, you always can come back and talk to us. So whenever I get a chance to tell people, especially in the beverage business, about the Gallo family, they're special. And so they launched me on my career. And so I started State Street Brewing Company in Chicago. Romano Brothers was the distributor. They were also invested in the business. So we got off to a very, very good start, right? Now, I'd like to tell you that it was a huge success, and it was at the beginning. I'd also like to tell you that the reason I'm not still doing it anymore is because I was ahead of my time. The real answer is I wasn't as good as Jim or Anthony or Sierra Nevada or everybody else who was around back then. And so I sold the business. I sold the business, but I stayed in the beer business, came back out here to Southern California, and took a job with Coors running the CDC Anaheim distribution company. And that's when I met Bill. That's where I met Dan Holland. That's where I met a lot of people out here in California. And that's where I met InBev as well, because it was a Coors distributor, but the biggest brand we had outside of Coors Light was Tecate, which was owned obviously by FEMSA. We had a joint venture with at the time, what was called Interbrew. And so I got to know those folks as well. And I'll never forget this. I was running CDC Anaheim, again, quite happy, when Dan Holland, who was running a beer distributor in Los Angeles, called me and said, Interbrew's got a job as head of sales. And I think you'd be perfect for that. I said, well, you might think I'm perfect for that. That doesn't mean they think I'm perfect for it. And I ended up, long story short, taking that job, and it launched my career with Interbrew. Now, when I joined Interbrew, it was still a private company, if you can believe that. It hadn't gone public yet. You think about today. So I was there for a number of years. I was there for the merger with AmBev. That was before 3G existed. It was the three guys, but they were running AmBev and some railroads and banks. They sold the bank. And so I was there when we went public, first of all, and then when we met the AmBev guys and did a merger of sort of equals, and I stayed there for the first couple of years of that ownership as well, and learned a lot, a tremendous amount, had a great time. And then I decided to leave there and go to work in the Coca-Cola system. The CEO at Interbrew and then InBev, when that merger happened, was a guy named John Brock. And John went to run CCE, and from the moment he got there was trying to get me to join the Coke system. And so I did. I joined Coke, and I spent a couple of years. I was over in Europe, so raising kids in Europe. And I joined CCE Europe, running that group, and then very quickly came to CCE North America to run that. Very quickly did a very big deal with the Coca-Cola Company, where they bought CCE North America and me. And I went with that, and then ultimately ended my career as running the Americas for Coca-Cola, which was just a brilliant run. I enjoyed every moment of it. Again, learned a lot. If you can't learn about branding and marketing while you're at Coca-Cola, then again, you're just not paying enough attention. And then I took a real different turn in my career, and I joined Nature's Bounty. It's called NBTY at the time. And as CEO, owned by private equity, owned by Carlyle. And again, a completely different experience. It was underwater in terms of their investment. It wasn't doing well. It was a turnaround job. And we turned it around very successfully in 3 years and broke the company in half, sold half of it to a PE firm in Europe, the business called Holland & Barrett, which is a big retailer. So I'd never run retail before. And sold the vitamin piece and bar piece to KKR. And we closed that deal on Friday and announced that the deal was closed. This was the end of September, and that I was leaving. And then on Monday, we made the announcement that I was joining Kellogg as the CEO of Kellogg. And so I took the weekend off and have spent the last, this is true, you can't make this stuff up. Today's my 2-year anniversary at Kellogg, actually. I started October 2nd, 2017. And so, thank you. So before I go on too long about this, a final story about joining Kellogg. The headhunter called and said, we've got this job, I've got this job, this guy I know very well. He said, I've got this job I think you'd just be perfect for, and I'd like to talk to you about it, but it's confidential, so I can't tell you what it is. I said, look, I was literally in the middle of the road show, and we were trying to sell this company to anybody with a big enough checkbook. So we were in China, we were in Europe, we were all over the place for 3 months doing like 10 presentations a day. It was unbelievable. I said, I am so busy. I've got zero time to consider anything. I'm very engaged in this. I'm going to see this thing through to its final close and then see what happens. And that timing wouldn't work for this job and so forth. Anyway, he called back a month later and said, the board's given me permission to tell you that the job is CEO of Kellogg. And I got chills down my spine. Kellogg. I was immediately transported to my 8-year-old self, sitting at my kitchen table with my mom and dad, eating Frosted Flakes. I thought, Kellogg, what an honor that would be. And it's been the honor of my life, really, to have this job. This is where I make my final stand. I have no intention to do anything but return Kellogg to the glory days of its past. And I'll get to exactly how we do that. But before, I'll show you, the only reason this chart is in here is because my team knows it's my favorite chart. So how are we doing? When I joined, the industry itself was really under a lot of strain. 3G had come in, they'd formed Kraft Heinz, and everything was about how fast you can grow your margins, how much you can cut costs. And my thesis at the beginning was we ought to be investing in these brands substantially. And I think we're underinvesting. So the very first quarter, the board approved a new business plan, and we literally poured over $100 million incrementally into marketing right away. And we've got the company from 5 years of decline in net sales to actually now growing 3 quarters in a row, which doesn't mean we're out of the woods and there's never any victory laps, but we are heading in the right direction in terms of where we are. And I have every intention, and the team has every intention, of making sure that the Kellogg Company is not destined for the dustbin of history, like a lot of critics say every packaged food company ultimately is. But the world's changed dramatically and continues to change. So what we do in the future is going to be very different than what we had to do in the past. And so I said I'd take you through a little bit of the journey of the Kellogg Company as well, because I think it's informative, where we've come from to where we are today and therefore where we're going. And so when I say it's an honor, I mean, it truly is an honor. We were founded by one of the great entrepreneurs of any time, and that's W.K. Kellogg. He invented breakfast. He revolutionized breakfast the way it's served today. He invented the cornflake. And that Kellogg cornflake is still around today. And so, sometimes we lose sight of some of these great entrepreneurs. We take it for granted and say, well, that's just cereal. But it didn't exist. There was no such thing as buying a box of something that was made from corn and processed into a breakfast food that was very convenient and very affordable and put on people's breakfast tables each and every day. And then, by the way, when he ended his career, he gave away his entire fortune to form the Kellogg Foundation. I'm a trustee at the foundation as well, and the work that they do every year in giving away hundreds of millions of dollars to underprivileged children around the world is really inspiring, and it inspires the company each and every day, and I think makes a unique culture really special. But it all started with one man and a vision and a dream. And he was also, I said, a great entrepreneur, but he was also a very early innovator. And some of my favorite stories that I've heard, I combed through the archives. I think I spent my first 2 months talking to everybody I could in the company at length, asking them what they loved about the company, what they would change, what they found special. And I also spent that time pouring through the archives to see what I could learn about where we'd come from. And this slide right here has got 3 really kind of cool stories on it. One, the woman who's winking, that was an early, very provocative at the time, promotion that the Kellogg Company ran. And it essentially said to housewives, go in, give your grocer a wink, and see what you get. Now, transport yourself back 80 years and think, oh, wow. Well, what you got was a free box of cereal, right? And so that was a very early, innovative type of thing. Kellogg had the first billboard in Times Square. Huge billboard with a mechanical spoon eating breakfast. Again, just very, very early, very, very innovative. When the Great Depression hit, I learned, if you look at a lot of companies didn't survive the Great Depression, obviously. And Mr. Kellogg said, when everybody's cutting their budgets, we're doubling our advertising budget. He doubled his advertising budget during the Great Depression. Came out of that era stronger than when they went into that era. So, these things never happen by accident. They happen because people do special things, inspired by, the right vision, the right plans, and executing them brilliantly. So we have a great, history and heritage. If you look at this timeline, it takes you from the very beginning, some of those early days that I talked about. He was also a very early innovator and entrepreneur when it came to going overseas. So very early, he went to Australia, he went to the UK, he went to Canada, he went to places where he thought, there's like-minded types of people. He started incredible brands, started with cornflakes, but some of those brands that were invented in the early years, Rice Krispies, Fruit Loops, Raisin Bran, they're still around today. Eggo Waffle, unbelievably powerful brands. We've continued to innovate. We've continued to acquire interesting brands like Morningstar Farms in the 70s. I'll talk more about that. I joke, Morningstar is a plant-based food. In my first year and 9 months at the company, I got 0 questions about Morningstar Farms. Beyond Meat goes public, and I get about 100 questions a day about Morningstar Farms and plant-based foods. But more about that in just a moment. The first purchase made under my watch was the RX Bar, started by terrific entrepreneurs in Chicago. Peter Rahal started a business in his garage, got it to $120 million in sales in the first couple of years, and it's more than double that just a year later. So that brand is a great innovator, and we learn more from that culture than we probably impart to them. And so it's a way of really keeping the company young, as well as obviously adding a very interesting brand. And we made a big acquisition in West Africa, in Nigeria. And Nigeria, my predecessor made the first investment there, and it's proved to be really brilliant. It's an incredible country, 120 million people, booming middle class, democratically elected government twice now turned over. But it's not for the faint of heart. One only need to fly into Lagos and spend a couple of days to understand it's courage to go to a place like that. But we've got a leading position in West Africa, coupled with what we've got in South Africa and acquisitions we made in Egypt. So we've got a very interesting strategy developing around Africa. And Africa, I really believe, is the continent of this century and perhaps even the next century. So really exciting stuff happened. But it all revolves and comes back to this world of iconic brands. And again, the real attraction for me in coming to the company was, it's been a gift for me to work on brands like, all the way back to the Gallo brands, to Stella Artois, to Coca-Cola and Sprite, and now to these unbelievable brands. So I've had a very, it's been a great gift for me to work on those brands that I've grown up with, all of those brands. And so that continues today. And, these are brands I think that, I always tell the team, if we do our job, the brightest days for these brands can be in the future. But it won't happen because we wish it to happen. It'll happen because we do the hard work each and every day to polish them, burnish them, innovate around them, and make them relevant, as relevant tomorrow as they were in the height of their powers in years gone past. And I think Nick, again, said something very, very important when he said, I'll paraphrase, I won't get it exactly right, but based on what types of brands are, there really are relevant brands and irrelevant brands. And so you can have awareness that's over 90% and still be irrelevant, right? Just because somebody knows your brand and just because they even like the logo and want to put it on a shirt doesn't mean they will actually drink it or buy it. It becomes, how relevant is this for me? And what occasions are you solving for me each and every day? So plant-based, I mentioned kind of in passing, but if I start to talk now and toggle towards how are we going to stay relevant in the future, we've got a really, really interesting portfolio, as I've already said. And one of the really interesting pieces in our portfolio is this brand called Morningstar Farms, which is plant-based food. And plant-based food, as I said, if you're, a lot of you are beverage people, but I'm sure you're well aware of what's happening in plant-based food and proteins and so on and so forth. And, we've got this very, very well-known, I'd call it iconic brand in our portfolio that we're really starting to spend a lot more time innovating around and investing in, and we've got it back to double-digit growth. And so it's an exciting place for us to be. It's larger than the company that just went public. It makes money. It's very profitable. And we think it's going to be a great space to innovate on. So at our last quarterly investor call, and by the way, I will refrain from any forward-looking statements, always a real worry, we announced the launch of Incogmeato. So this is going to be our refrigerated play. It's more of a meat analog, right? So we're veg forward in what we do with Morningstar Farms, and we're unapologetically veg forward because there are different occasions here. And a lot of people who love veggie burgers and love vegetarian food are actually repulsed by the idea of something made from plants that actually tastes like meat, looks like meat, bleeds like meat. It's not what they want. But there's a certain consumer that does want something that eats like meat, tastes, smells, behaves like meat, and they come at it from different ways. Some of it come from a health and wellness perspective. More and more, they're coming from an environmental perspective, right? They understand that a lot of meat production, just call it animal production for food, is pretty trying on the environment. And so there's been an explosion in plant-based alternatives. And we'll be launching this Incogmeato early next year, and we're really excited about it. I've personally been in the kitchen every week trying our foods. I think our foods you got to get the food right? To state the blindingly obvious, food has to win, and we believe our food wins. And so we're really excited about this as another growth platform for the company. Another way we stay relevant is, and this is not unique to us, you've seen a lot of companies do this. Coca-Cola was an early adopter with venturing emerging brands. And a lot of our peers are doing it as well. But 1894 Capital is our in-house venture capital firm. We've made a number of investments that are exciting for us. We've invested in some of the ones you see here, Cooley Cooley, Bright Greens, that we are very optimistic about their future. Bright Greens, just to give you one example, and I'll talk for a few minutes about sustainability, but we like the play there because think about plant-based, vitamin-enriched, really healthy stuff that's basically like a bouillon cube that you drop into water, shake it up in your own dispenser, and you've made a smoothie without all the mess that comes with juicing in your home. Juicing in your home is a wonderful thing, but you don't want to necessarily do it all the time, so it puts the convenience into it. We think it's a really interesting play. But it's also innovating around our brands that are big today and continue to be relevant to our consumers. And some examples here. So Cheez-It is our cracker brand. It does extremely well. We've got Cheez-It, the core brand. We've got Cheez-It Grooves, which do very well. And we launched at the beginning of this year Cheez-It Snapped, which is an entirely different chip. It's much more like a salty type of play. It's a different texture. It still plays on Cheez-It's core equity of being all natural, real cheese on, in this case, your chip and not your cracker. And it's off to a flying start. So good, in fact, we're unfortunately on allocation, and we're working as hard as we can to install new lines of capacity. We cannot make enough Cheez-It Snapped. Proving that if you have a great brand, you innovate, and you have unbelievable food, an open bag of Cheez-It Snapped in front of me doesn't stand a chance. It is delicious food. Rice Krispies Treats, a brand that's back to double-digit growth, been around for a long time. And again, thinking about critics that say this, if you're in the center of store, that category is dead and forgotten. Rice Krispies Treats is sold in the center of store. And it's been around a long time, and it's growing very, very nicely. We launched Rice Krispies Poppers, which are more on-the-go, snack size, small bites, with more indulgence to them. So it plays much more pushing into the confectionery type of space. And that's off to a blindingly good start as well. And we're at full capacity in terms of everything that we can produce there. So big brands, if they innovate, they stay relevant, can be as exciting as those small upstart brands. They don't earn the right. They have to earn the right. Just being 100 years old obviously doesn't do that. You have to stay contemporary, relevant. You have to innovate, and you always have to watch the quality of your food to make sure you're always moving in a more positive direction. But what's next? So again, I loved Nick's presentation at the very beginning. I wish I saw it before. I've got a number of, well, maybe just reinforces that the world really is moving in an interesting direction. So yeah, this is a 3D printer, putting out a T-bone steak. And it's interesting because this stuff is really happening. 3D food is happening. It's real. And the question I thought was a brilliant one around, the paradigm around, well, wait, I want authentic, I want real, I want all natural, I don't want any kind of processing on the one hand. And 3D printing made in the lab, I'll have that too. And so it's coming to grips with these competing realities that I think is one of the real interesting questions for entrepreneurs, for leaders, and so forth, because it's coming. And there are competing narratives and there's competing objectives. On the one hand, all that all-natural stuff and so forth oftentimes comes with a huge carbon footprint. And 3D printing doesn't. But you lose, again, the authenticity of being out on the farm. And like it or not, I tell my kids, we're not all going to return to an agrarian culture where you live, you never leave the house again, right? You never leave the house, you game all day, you farm in the evening, and you eat what you harvest from your garden, right? That's not going to be the reality, but the reality is going to be compellingly different than what it is today. And another thing, just a few moments on, that I think is really wildly interesting is the whole notion of personalization, which is coming and it's real. And this notion of really understanding your biome, your microbiome, having that completely articulated from you, from experts, and then having a diet that matches your very unique biome is real. The technology exists today, it's just not at scale. Now, the interesting thing will be what people really do with that, right? Because again, always remember, I try and always remind myself, and again, the blindingly obvious, what people tell you and what they actually do are wildly different things. We all talk about ourselves in our aspirational sense, which is why your Instagram feed and social network is, I think it was Brad Paisley who said online, he had this song, "Online, I'm so much cooler." He's 6'3" and this, I think he's pretty cool anyway, but it's this notion of what people say is really around their aspirations and what they do is behavioral. And finding that linkage is really important because giving them what they really want, that's also aspirational. It's finding that crossover moment that oftentimes is really, really special to launching brands. And so one of the things I think about when it comes to that is, I love this picture. Is this guy fit or is this guy fat, right? And it's the bifurcation that is all around us in so many ways, whether it's, again, sustainability, whether it's health and wellness, you name it. Everybody wants to be healthier. There's a real health and wellness megatrend. There's no question about that, right? And making your foods healthier all the time is not only a noble endeavor, but I think a good business objective. But my snacks business is on fire. People love snacking. People, want to snack and they will continue to snack. But people also want to be well. And so it's coming to grips with that, bifurcation of the world. And, people talk about the East Coast and the West Coast, and you have to get that right. But we also always should remind ourselves to go park at a discount store in the middle of the country one day and just watch for 10 hours who's going in and who's going out, right? And it's just understanding the world around us is so incredibly diverse and bifurcated in so many ways. And in between those bifurcations, by the way, is this vast continuum where all of us sit somewhere. And so recognizing that, I think, is incredibly important for all of our businesses and getting it right. But getting it fun is also really important, right? So one of the things that we're really excited about is some of the programs we have that really bring fun back into things. And again, there was talk before about how people are going out less. Young people are going out less. That's true. But they're still going out a lot, right? And so it's not been a precipitous drop-off. And by the way, when they're home, when they're cocooning, they are more social than, we all know this. They're incredibly social. One of the biggest social endeavors right now is gaming. Gaming is a spectator sport. You probably all know that. If you're not familiar with Twitch, you should be. One of the biggest sports to watch, I call it a sport because I'm cool, is gaming. Right? People sit and watch and they have teams and they get engaged and it's unbelievable. And we've done a tremendous amount with our Pringles brand around gaming that's been wildly successful because it's very relevant to gamers and where they are. And this slide here is something that's really taken off in Asia. So if you think about Asia and in Japan in particular and South Korea in particular, Gambling is a really big, people love to gamble. Not necessarily always high stakes, but they just love the art of, I'm gambling for something. And all these things, you remember, in your local bowling alley or carnival or Santa Monica Pier, those claw games. You put in money, you try and grab the claw, you operate the claw, you get a stuffed animal. Well, they're doing that for food and for staples and all sorts of things. So they've got these massive things set up, acres with these machines, because not only can I then gamble, but I can gamble, have fun, and get the stuff that I need. And so we're selling a ton of Pringles through these things. Who would have thought? It's just amazing, but it's fun and it's relevant. And so in the last couple of minutes, two more ideas for you. So, I love this Jetsons slide. And to me, it informs so much. I grew up watching the Jetsons, and it was like, yeah, right, we're going to press a button someday and have a coffee made for us. We're going to press a button and have a steak or this. It's all here, right? It's absolutely here. But it's really worth considering, and other speakers have said this, because the Jetsons existed because really sharp, creative minds at one point thought, I wonder if we could do this, and imagine if. And so much of great innovation is inspired by imagine if. Imagine if I never had to leave the home and I could get this. That's what's happening. That, to me, is so much of the inspiration. So if you're a bottler, if you're in some of these businesses, imagine if consumers one day said, I actually don't want plastic anymore. Somebody talked about that. I don't want the idea of a truck rumbling around the streets. I don't want 10 packages delivered to my front door wrapped in cardboard. Again, all these different competing narratives. Young people say that. They care about the environment. Amazon comes to their house 11 times a day, right? So the world's going to change, and supply chains are going to, they're going to have to adapt. And so the idea of, a Pepsi or a Coke selling their concentrate in a bouillon type form and dropping it in carbonated water, whether that be SodaStream or something else, it's not crazy anymore. None of it's crazy. And I don't know what the world's going to look like in 10 years, but it's going to be so vastly different than it is today. And it's so exciting to be part of this space. And then the final point is around this notion. Again, I'm trying to bring something relevant for everybody in this room, whether you're beverage, food, or so forth. Something we're spending a lot of time on is this notion of sensory activation. And so if you think about the gigantic movement of baby boomers, that's happening right now. It's been happening for years, continues to happen. One of the first things we lose when we cross over to age 50 is our sense of smell, right? It becomes lesser and lesser over time. Smell and taste, obviously, are so closely linked. So you've got innovators and entrepreneurs opening new concept restaurants where you go in and it's pitch black. You sit down, you eat your meal in the dark. Why? Because the notion is without your sight, all your other sight and your senses become more heightened, including your taste. You get more out of your meal, right? And that's going to happen, those types of things. So amping up flavors, changing flavors, thinking about things from a personalization standpoint has never been more important. But even as the countries around the world age, the way our bodies develop over time and change over time is something really, really interesting when you're thinking about entrepreneurs and when you're thinking about what to bring to your consumers that adds value. So with that, I'll stop and say, I don't know what else is around the corner, but boy, I can't wait for the next 5 or 10 years because it's going to be, the Jetsons era is here. So I hope I have a minute or two for questions.